Hi everyone and welcome back to a new episode of Diagnosedan. Today we're working on a 2000 Peugeot Partner, and this car was brought to me as a crank no start. Now normally an older car, a crank no start should be quite a simple diagnosis. And I wasn't even planning on filming it until this case became interesting, more interesting, and even more interesting. Now I've already diagnosed this car, and in this video I'm going to take you through the steps I took to diagnose this vehicle, and hopefully we can all learn something from it. And in the end, you're not going to believe what was causing this crank no start. So let's diagnose it together. Some time ago, I was contacted by another workshop and they told me, hey Dan, in the workshop we've got a Peugeot Partner, which is a crank no start. And it started out as a car that was stalling. We tried to fix it, we tried to diagnose it, but symptoms got worse and worse. And right now it's a complete crank no start. We invested a lot of time, a lot of money, we replaced a lot of parts, but still the car is not fixed. We know the car is not worth a lot because it's a 2000 Peugeot Partner, but this car was converted to hold a wheelchair. So to the owners, it's priceless and it's really expensive to replace it with a new one. To the owners, it really means the world. So I told them, you know what, bring the car. I'm gonna diagnose it for free. So also for you guys helping me today you're not getting paid. Now, as always, let's start out by confirming the customer complaint. Well, that's customer complaint confirmed. Now, let me show you what they've replaced on this car. They replaced the ignition coil with an NGK one, which is a good brand. And I think this is the new one. And I think they reinstalled the old one. They changed out the crankshaft sensor. They sent the immobilizer with the engine ECU and the keys to AC-Tronics to get it tested. And it tested fine. They replaced the spark plugs. They replaced a lot of things, but still this car is not fixed. Now, an important thing to notice is that the car is exactly the same it came into my shop, so nothing changed. Everything is still the same. Now, the first thing I did after confirming the customer complaint is scan the car for fault codes. And at this point, I was thinking this is gonna be a 10-minute diag. It's an older car, crank no start. This is gonna be a walk in the park. And I was so wrong. Now, in the next step, we're gonna scan the car for fault codes, and hopefully there's something stored that could give us direction that could determine our next step. Now, before we do that, I'm gonna hook up a battery maintainer because after that, we need to do some testing, and I don't wanna worry about the battery voltage. Now, after we scan the car for fault codes, we need to do some testing. The ignition needs to be on for a long time. Maybe we need to crank the car. So when you're diagnosing a car and it's gonna take longer than 10 minutes, like in this case, it's always a good idea to hook up a battery maintainer so you don't need to worry about the battery voltage. So I scanned the entire car for fault codes, and obviously there's something wrong with the car because it won't start, right? Now, this is what I found after scanning the car for fault codes. No fault codes stored whatsoever. Now at this point I was thinking, well, this is still gonna be easy, right? We've got no fault code stored, but we're gonna check for spark, fuel, air, compression, all the regular stuff, and this should be sorted in no time. So the first thing I did is check for spark, and it's exactly what we're going to do right now. I'm gonna crank the car while you guys see if we get any spark. So I removed the spark plug and the spark plug wire. I'm gonna crank the car, and you guys are going to watch for spark. And one more time. And as you can see, absolutely no spark. I guess the no spark is the reason why the technician at the other shop at some point decided to change the ignition coil, which obviously didn't fix the problem. Now, a no spark is of course enough to make the car not start or not run. But just to be thorough and to see what's going on, to paint a picture, I want to hook up an oscilloscope to the injectors and see if the injectors are being controlled. I quickly hooked up the oscilloscope to the control side of injector number 2. Now I'm going to crank the engine over while you guys are going to watch the scope screen to see if the injector is being controlled while I'm cranking the engine. We were measuring on the control side of the injector. We could see there was power coming to the injector through the injector coil to the control side, but the control side was never pulled to ground. The injector was never activated. Now, I did the same measurement on the ignition coil and it's not being controlled either. Now, the big question is, why? This engine uses a Magneti Marelli engine computer, and these computers are known to fail. Now, what are the symptoms when they fail? Exactly. It stops controlling the injectors and it stops controlling the ignition coil. But this ECU was tested at AC-Tronics, so I thought, let's give them a call. I called them up and I said, hey, I've got this Magneti Marelli computer and it stopped controlling my injectors and it stopped controlling my ignition coil. You guys have tested it. Are you 100% sure? They said, well, we'll have a talk with the technician that tested it and we'll have a look at the report and we'll get back to you. And within a few hours, they called back and they said, over here, everything was functioning as it should. Now, although it was quite a big coincidence that my engine ECU was not controlling the injectors and the ignition coil, I must say the guy at AC-Tronics was sounding pretty confident there was nothing wrong with the computer. So I was thinking, let's bidirectionally control the injector to open with the scan tool, and if it opens, then at least we know it's able to open it and there's nothing wrong with the driver. Once again, the oscilloscope hooked up to the control side of injector number 2. Now let's go to the scan tool and let's select functional test, actuator test, and then let's control injector number 2. Now let's press start. And I don't know if you can hear that, but take a look at our scope screen. That injector is definitely being controlled. So there's nothing wrong with our driver. So at this point, we are pretty sure there's nothing wrong with the driver inside the ECU. It is able to command the injector, and I'm also pretty sure it's able to command the ignition coil. Now, at this point, I'm leaning towards an input problem. Now, I remember this car having a tachometer. Tachometer, somehow, it's very hard for me to pronounce, so I'm gonna call it an RPM gauge. This car has got an RPM gauge, but I don't remember seeing the needle move while I was cranking the car over. So let's have a closer look. We're inside the car, and over here we've got our RPM gauge. Now I'm gonna crank the car over, and we're gonna see if that needle is going to move. Now, as you could see, that needle didn't move at all. Now, as you can see, that needle didn't move. Now, this doesn't mean anything yet. It's an older car. I don't know the history. Maybe the gauge wasn't working before. So let's take a look at scan data and see if the engine computer is getting an RPM signal. So I selected the RPM data pit on the scan tool, and right now it's at 0. So you need to keep an eye on this line, and obviously when I crank the car, that number or that line should change. Now, let's press record, and right now I'm gonna crank the car over. Let's have a look. Whoops. Now what just happened is, every time I crank the car over, I lose communication with my Bluetooth dongle. So what I probably need to do is crank the car over and then select the data pit to see the RPM signal. Now it would be very convenient if one of you guys came over and cranked the car for me, but since we're doing this diag for free and you're not getting paid, you're probably not going to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to crank the car and film it from the driver's seat. So let's find out if we've got an RPM signal. I've got it working right now. I don't know what went wrong. Maybe there was something wrong with the battery voltage, although we got a maintainer on it. Anyway, when I crank it over right now, the data stays live. I also decided to select the entire data pit list. Now, this is an old engine and we haven't got a lot of data, so it's very hard to see if you're looking at live data. But right now, when I press the accelerator pedal, you can see that the full load detected changes state from no to yes when I press the pedal, and when I release it, it changes to no. That means, and this proves, we are looking at live data. Now at the top, we've got the engine RPM, so let's crank it over. And you can see the engine RPM stays at 0, but when I press the accelerator pedal, the state changes from no to yes, so we are looking at live data. So this means the engine computer is not reading engine speed. It looks like the engine computer is not reading the engine speed. When it's not reading the engine speed, it doesn't think the engine is running, and of course it's not going to control the injectors or the ignition coil. So in that way, it makes a lot of sense. Now the engine speed signal comes from the crankshaft position sensor, but that was already changed for a brand new one by the previous workshop. Now the crankshaft position sensor is located on top of the gearbox, close to the engine, and it's reading from the flywheel, and it's got a connector over here. We're not going to measure at this connector, but we're going to measure the signal all the way at the engine computer so we know the signal actually makes it to the computer. Now I'm going to crank the engine over while you guys are going to have a look at that signal. Now, as you can see, that looks like a perfect RPM signal, making it all the way into the computer, but the computer is just not seeing it, it's not reading it. So at this point, I was pretty sure there was something wrong with the engine computer. So I called AC-Tronics again and I said, hey man, I don't know, maybe there's a loose connection, maybe it's intermittent, but you really need to test this computer again. And they said, no problem, ship it to us, we'll retest it, maybe it's intermittent, maybe we missed something, but we will let you know. So 3 days later, and I was really waiting for that phone call telling me, Dan, we've seen it now, it's an intermittent fault, we're gonna repair the computer, it was no good. But 3 days later, they called me and they told me, Dan, there's nothing wrong with this engine computer. And this time, they sounded even more confident than the first time. So what do we do at this point? We know the RPM signal is making it all the way into the computer, but the computer is just not seeing it, it's not reading it. But when I send this computer to another company to get it tested, over there on the bench, everything is working fine. So it must be missing something, right? So I decided to go over all my steps again. I'm measuring powers, I'm measuring grounds, I'm measuring pin fitments, I'm checking the connector, but everything turns out to be perfect. So at this point, I'm getting a little bit desperate. What was supposed to be a 10-minute job is turning into days. Now, on the other hand, I'm getting more and more determined to get this car diagnosed and fixed and make the customers happy again. So at this point, I decided to clear my entire agenda for the next day. I canceled all my appointments because I really needed to get this car done. Work was piling up and I needed to get this out of the way. So I was thinking, what's different when we test this computer on the car compared to when they test it on a bench? Well, we are using the crankshaft position sensor, right? But on a bench, they're probably using a signal generator. And I was thinking, hey, I've got one of those. So I decided to hook up my signal generator and generate a known good signal into the connector of the crankshaft position sensor. Now, let's do that and let's see what happens. Right now, the RPM signal is at 0, as you can see. Now, let's send the signal into the wiring harness, and right away, you hear the engine coming alive, and just look at this. So at this point I was thinking, hey, finally some progress. I was really relieved. I was finally onto something. So I was thinking there must be something wrong with the signal. Although it looks perfect, the computer is just not reading it. So I was thinking I still have got the old crankshaft position sensor laying in the car. Let's reinstall it and see what happens. So I reinstalled the old crankshaft position sensor. It's a 10-minute job. It's just one 10 mil bolt and then that connector, of course. And this is the old or new crankshaft position sensor that was installed, which we replaced with the old one. Now let's see what happens when we try to start up the car. Now come on, can you believe that? It starts right up. So right now things were starting to make sense to me. The auto shop told me that all the complaints started when the car started stalling. Now, when you got a bad crankshaft position sensor, it probably fails when it heats up. Now, then the car stalls. When it cools down, it starts again. So this sensor probably fails when it heats up. Now, the other workshop probably replaced it with a very cheap aftermarket one. So I called my parts supplier and I said, have you got a decent brand sensor for me? And he said, yeah, I've got a Bosch. So they sent this Bosch to me, and this is the number. Let's install it and see what happens. So right now I've got the Bosch installed right out of the box. This is the number. Now let me see. This is the old one that the car actually runs on. And you can see it. It's old. Come on, focus. That's the old one. And this is the new replaced one that the car doesn't run on. Now, new Bosch installed right out of the box. Let's see what happens. So at this point I was like, what's going on? I just replaced it with a brand new Bosch sensor and now it doesn't run again. So I called the other workshop, talked to the technician that replaced the sensor, and I said, what did you put in it? And he said, a brand new Bosch sensor. And I was like, no way. So I called my parts supplier and I said, have you got anything else? He said, I only got this cheaper Era brand. And I said, I don't care. I just want to know what's going on. Bring it to me and I'll install it. So here it is, cheaper Era brand. Let's install it and let's see what happens. So right now I've got the Era or Era, I honestly don't know how to pronounce it, sensor installed. And let me see, this is the, is it the old one? Yeah, this is the old sensor, Bosch Era installed. So let's see what happens. And absolutely no problem. Let's try again. Now let's do one final check. Let's hook up the oscilloscope to the known good working sensor and compare that waveform to the waveform we've got of the Bosch sensor. Now to do a fair comparison, I need to make this car a no start. When I start it right now, it will run. So I will unhook the connector for the ignition coil and make sure the car doesn't run. This is an inductive sensor, and when the RPM increases, the amplitude will increase. So let's hook up the oscilloscope and do this test. Now let's do a side-by-side comparison. You can see that the differences are very tiny, but apparently the differences are big enough to make the Bosch sensor not work. Now you would never notice this unless you had them side by side. Now what do you think? Who needs to pay for all the time and money that was invested? I mean, I invested a lot of time, the other shop invested a lot of time. We invested in getting the ECU tested twice, and it all wouldn't have been necessary if we were supplied with a decent product. Now, one thing I know for sure, the customer doesn't need to pay for this diagnosis. We promised to do it for free, and we're gonna stick to our promise, and I'm pretty sure they're gonna be thrilled to have the car back. Now, I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please subscribe to my channel, and when you hit the little bell, you will get a notification each time I upload a new video. And remember, Diagnosedan, fixed it again. See you next time, guys. Now, as you could see from the waveform, the signal of the Bosch sensor was inverted. So what I did, I hooked up jumper wires in between the connector, and right now everything is connected the way the sensor came. Now, there are 3 wires, but one of them is a ground shield wire, and for this test it's not really necessary to hook it up. So let's try and start the car. And as you can hear, the engine did not start up. So let's invert these wires. So right now I inverted them, and let's try again. So it looks like Bosch wired these sensors wrong. We're inside the car, and over here we've got our we're inside the car, and over here we've got our RPM gauge. Now I'm going to start the car, and we're going to see if that needle. We're inside the car, and over here we've got our from the Bosch sensor. Now maybe there was something wrong with the battery voltage. By the way, we've got a little friend over here. Hi, friend. Yeah.